as an investor, what I look at is people always say grade, grade, grade is like in real estate, location, location, location. But that's not really true anymore because all the high grade material has been discovered, has been exploited. What I would look for is if you find a deposit that has a consistent grade, it could be a low grade, is what is the product that you can make from that? And how much is it going to cost you to make that product? Because at the end of the day, it's always economics. Economics to dig it out of the ground, economics to convert it into perhaps an intermediate, which could be your final product or could not, and then the economics to make the final product. So what I look for is jurisdiction. How consistent is the law going to be applied? Am I going to sign a deal and then 5 years later I've got a different tax regime or a different government in there? How comfortable am I about the jurisdiction? I'm very comfortable in Indonesia, and some people might think that's not a stable jurisdiction, but it is. I'm sometimes not comfortable in a jurisdiction such as Canada because you don't know how long it'll take to permit, but that is a factor. Second thing I look for after jurisdiction is who is promoting the project? How experienced are they in the space? Are they somebody who understands the market? And when I say the market, not only the business you're in, say the nickel business, or is it somebody who's just gotten in recently and is maybe promoting something that they don't understand? Because we're all people. So if I believe in the management team, if I believe in the jurisdiction, then now I'll start to drill down into the actual resource. How comfortable am I with the resource? Does it meet the requirements of, in Canada, of 43101, or in Australia, JORC, or in South Africa, their requirements? It really doesn't matter, but how comfortable am I that the people are saying, this is what we have in the ground? And then the next step I'll say is how much test work have they done off the resource to demonstrate the next product that they're going to make? That product may be concentrate, such as in the case of Giga Metals, which is making a concentrate. That product may be a matte, that product may be NPI. But how much work have they actually done on it to prove out the viability of that? And then finally we come down to the cost. What's it going to cost to build it? What's it going to cost to operate it? And how much external factors can affect those costs? For example, we have two operations that both say they have a nickel sulfide product. One of them has perhaps a little bit more iron associated with the nickel. So if they want to make a product like an MHP, they need to add sulfuric acid. The other product has a nickel sulfide with sufficient sulfur that they don't need to purchase sulfuric acid. So if you're operating the two with the same electricity cost, which one is going to be more susceptible to swings in commodity input price? It's going to be the one where you have to buy the sulfuric acid versus the one that comes with its own sulfur. So those are some of the things I look for. So if I look at a whole suite of 20 or 30 nickel projects, there might be only 2 or 3 that meet that criteria for me. If I'm an investor that's currently looking at nickel, I'm going to hypothesize that that investor is looking at nickel because of the expected boom in EVs. So that will narrow it down to a certain type of product is what are the EV manufacturers looking for in nickel so that they can streamline their manufacturing process. Early on, manufacturers were using pure nickel briquettes to make an intermediate product called nickel sulfate, which was also called a premium product because they had to take pure nickel, dissolve it, and make nickel sulfate, which was the first building block in lithium-ion batteries. And unfortunately, I understand that you take nickel sulfate, and nickel sulfate becomes a building block of PCAM, which is your precursor cathode active material, also called a ternary material. You take that PCAM and then you turn it into CAM, cathode active material, which is actually the cathode in a lithium-ion battery. It's a metal alloy. So if you work backwards, you say, what is the primary product that the EV battery makers are looking for? 5 years ago, 6 years ago, it was nickel briquettes. Nickel briquettes were a pure form of nickel, 99.9% nickel. You dissolved it in acid. You had nickel sulfate in a fairly pure form, a little bit of impurity removal, and then you could precipitate pure nickel sulfate crystals. With the cost of nickel appreciating over the last 5 years as the demand went up, you saw manufacturers looking for cheaper alternatives. So they moved down the value chain of nickel. Instead of the final form of nickel like briquettes, which is deliverable to the London Metals Exchange, you went to what is used to make nickel briquettes. So nickel briquettes are made from intermediate products. And there's 3 primary intermediate products out there right now. There is MHP, mixed hydroxide precipitate, which is about 40% nickel, 3% cobalt, and the balance of it is a hydrated water molecule, and you've got some impurities. You know, you've got a little bit of iron, maybe 1% iron, you've got some sulfur in there, you've got a little bit of aluminum, a little bit of manganese, not much. Then there's MSP, a mixed sulfide precipitate, which is another way of concentrating nickel. And then you have nickel matte, which is a form of nickel sulfide that's been smelted to reject a lot of the impurities and a lot of the iron. It's about 75% nickel, but it's lower in cobalt, and then it's a high degree of sulfur, about 25% sulfur, and then you have some iron. The question is, though, which of those three are most likely to fall in the EV battery chain? If I have pure nickel product, 99.9%, like a briquette I told you, can I use all class 1 nickel for the production of EVs? And the answer is no. Class 1 is typically divided into two forms. One is a powder that's turned into a briquette, and the other one is nickel cathode, which is electroplated nickel. So ironically, what you're doing to make class 1 nickel is you put nickel sulfate in solution, then you recover it as pure nickel. So let's take Nornickel for example. They make class 1 nickel. They make cathode. So does Vale, so does Glencore, a lot of companies. The problem with class 1 nickel cathode is its full density. So it takes forever to dissolve in acid. So we've seen that somebody who's desperate for powder will take class 1 nickel cathode and atomize it to turn it into powder to get a high surface area. Because when you have a cathode, it's a very low surface area for the amount of nickel you have in there. So if you were to take a nickel briquette and put it in that bath of acid at 80 degrees C and stir it, you might have it dissolve in 24 hours. If you were to take the same quantity of nickel cathode, it might take a week. So it's a very inefficient use of nickel cathode. Nickel cathode was really invented to recover nickel for use in alloys, primarily stainless steel, but also in superalloys for jet engines. So that is its ultimate destination. But I think going forward, if the demand for class 1 nickel for batteries increases, you might see some nickel cathode plants convert from cathode to perhaps recovering that nickel as some other form. Not maybe metallic, it could be a crude nickel sulfate crystal, it could be an MHP, it could be some other form of chemical or a nickel oxide. The extraction technologies that are being talked about now are really laboratory chemistry from universities that have been known or hypothesized for years. So most ores, whether they be nickel or say copper, typically come in two forms. There's an oxide or a sulfide. If you have a sulfide ore, you've got a fuel source that comes with it, because to liberate the nickel from the sulfur in a sulfide ore, historically it's been pyrometallurgical. You burn it, you burn the sulfur, and you make SO2 gas, you recover it as sulfuric acid, but you liberate the nickel into a form that can be easily leached in acid and dissolved. Nickel oxide's a little bit more difficult. It takes 3 times the energy to recover nickel from an oxide than it does a sulfide, because you're breaking a stronger chemical bond. So nickel oxide we would typically get in laterites, such as a limonite or a saprolite. And the extraction technology from laterites are twofold, is pyrometallurgical to make ferronickel or NPI, and that's really you're melting the entire earth that you dig up. You push away the slag, which is your aluminum, your magnesium, and you recover a product of basically iron and nickel. But there's also hydrometallurgical means of pulling nickel out of laterites, and it's acid leaching. You're basically dissolving the entire earth in acid, and then you're selectively pulling out the nickel. Now, sulfuric acid has been the medium of dissolution for decades because sulfur is a plentiful element. You can make sulfuric acid from burning it, and you get energy out of it as a heat source. And then you have sulfuric acid, and it's not expensive to make sulfuric acid, then neutralize it, dispose of it. So what happens though is you have a lot of iron remaining. But now we hear things about chloride leaching or nitric acid leaching, hydrochloric acid leaching, nitric acid leaching. You're doing the same thing as sulfuric acid, but you're changing the temperature. You don't need high pressure equipment because you'll dissolve it at a lower temperature. But at the end of the day, you're still dissolving everything. And we hear about technologies that say they generate no waste. Well, then you're generating all product. So if you think that most nickel laterites are 1% nickel, to make 10,000 tons of nickel, which is a small nickel extraction in a year, you need to process 1 million tons of ore. So you've got now 990,000 tons of material that you've extracted from the ground that you can't use. If you acidify it, you've got to do certain things with it. You've got to neutralize the acid, and then you've got to determine, can I dispose of this in a responsible manner? Some of these technologies say, well, we're not going to dispose of this material, we're going to use it all. We're going to recover the iron, we're going to recover the manganese. That's great, but you've got to neutralize that acid, then you've lost that acid. So nitric acid and hydrochloric acid are very expensive in terms of sulfuric acid. If you're not neutralizing the acid, if you're recovering it, you're using some form of energy to reverse the acidic reaction, get the acid back out, and then you've got to recover the iron, the manganese, the magnesium, all of the other elements that came in there. You've got to determine, is there a market for it? Or are you just saying, I have a byproduct? So a lot of these new technologies, they'll work great in a laboratory, but when you look at them on a commercial scale, sometimes it's just not feasible or practical. And the other challenge with some of these new game-changing technologies is the materials of construction. 60 years ago, when HPAL, high-pressure acid leaching, utilizing sulfuric acid, was introduced, titanium was such an exotic metal, you just couldn't afford to make titanium piping. So you had to use special brick-lined piping or brick-lined vessels, because at temperatures at about 230 degrees Celsius, and the acid concentrations where you have 40 gram per liter free acid, it would eat through anything. But fast forward metallurgy, and we've got materials like duplex and hastelloys and high nickel alloys, which can resist acid at high temperature, and then ultimately titanium. Nitric acid and hydrochloric acid, they tend to dissolve everything. And the materials of construction, although they exist, on a commercial scale, when you're talking about making 10, 20, 30,000 tons a year of nickel and processing such great quantities of material, you've got a challenge. You've got erosion, you've got corrosion, and you've got fatigue. None of this has been proven on a commercial scale. So I say that's a great chemistry equation. I think you can make it work in a laboratory because you've got skilled technicians there tweaking everything, making sure all the chemistry is right, making sure the temperature is right. Now when you build a plant that is processing, instead of 40 liters per hour, 4,000 cubic meters per hour, the cost of running that right on the line may be prohibitive. And if one person maybe does something wrong and you corrode a vessel, you've just shut down and you've cost yourself millions of dollars in equipment and downtime. So these technologies have been known, but there's a reason they have not been economically deployed on a commercial scale yet. So if you're an investor and you're worried about the environmental footprint of the project, you have to look at three types of effluents, emissions or tailings. You have solids, you have liquids, and you have atmospheric. When you use pyrometallurgy to extract nickel from sulfides, you have SO2 as a gas, which you recover in a very efficient scrubbing system as a sulfuric acid. And you also make a glassy type of material like slag, like welding slag. When you see them, that's the same thing that comes out, which carries your impurities, and that is your tailings. But the glassy slag can be used in road construction and cement, and the SO2 can be recovered as sulfuric acid. That's actually a very responsible way of getting tailings out of nickel. The problem is the materials for that, the high-grade sulfide deposits, do not exist anymore, and nobody's building any more smelters. When you're using hydrometallurgy and acidic leaching like HPAL, you're creating vast volumes of liquid slurry that is acidic. As I said, if you extract 1 million tons of ore and recover 10,000 tons of nickel, you've got 990,000 tons of goo, and it's usually at a pH of 1.8. So you have to, it's not easy to separate the liquid from the solids. You can de-water, use these big ponds and get the liquid off. You have to neutralize the liquid, so you're using something like a calcium carbonate to neutralize it to a pH 8, which is basically the ocean. But you still have these acidic solids sitting there, so you have to either impound them on land in a lined pond so it doesn't leach into the ground, And that is very challenging because you're thinking of an area the size of your mine site that you have to put it in. And or you can dispose of it in a waterway, typically the ocean. There's a reason a lot of HPAL operations are near oceans, so that they have a place to dispose of the water, because HPALs are not water neutral. There's not a neutrality. The amount of water you put out is not the same amount of water you need. You're actually creating more water, and it's not a useful form. You've got to dispose of it. So the tailings have to be, you have to look at your environment. A lot of companies will say, we dry stack tailings, but then you have to think to yourself, if you're in the Amazon in Brazil, or if you're in the rainforest in Indonesia, how can you dry stack when the net rainfall is 1.5 meters of water a year? You're just adding water back to it. If you're putting these tailings and you say, we're impounding them on land, but are you in a seismic area where a little shake and bake, a little earthquake will just liquefy this mud and it could spread out? Is the pond lined? Are they neutralizing it? Limestone is very expensive. And if you don't have your own limestone source, you have to buy it. It adds to the cost. Or there's some operations in Australia, they have the benefit of being in the desert, so they have net evaporation. That is actually one of the best, right? The problem is the ore bodies in Australia are never near where you need them to be. And then finally you have marine disposal, also known as deep sea tailings, which is misunderstood. The general public perception thinks it's a very bad form, but it's actually not. If the tailings are treated properly, such as neutralized to a proper pH, and if the tailings are deposited into an area in a deep canyon where they remain inert, it's not bioavailable to the marine life. You can't just dump it into the surface near a coral reef. Nobody does that. That would be irresponsible. But if your operation is near a deep underwater canyon, minimum 1.5 kilometers deep, because of the nature of the tailings, they usually come out of the pipe and go down to the bottom and just deposit. And there's usually not a lot of life down there. And there's very good environmental impacts done before that. So if you're an investor saying, you should ask yourself, is this operation a sulfide or an oxide? If it's a sulfide, there's a pretty good idea that it's pyrometallurgical. I'm going to feel comfortable about the tailings. If it's hydrometallurgical, I'm going to know, okay, what are they doing with the tailings? Are the tailings acidic? Are they dewatering them? Are they just dumping them on land and hoping people don't recognize that? Look for that. Do the homework. A lot of companies will not tell you in their public disclosure what they do with the tailings. Contact the investor relations office. Ask them, I notice you're near the ocean. What are you doing with your tailings? Have them respond to you.